A lot of people have a lot of things to say about the end of The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, and I am one of them. Hello, my name is Leah, and I have been a Hunger Games girly from the very beginning. A bit of context where I'm entering this discussion from: I was pretty late to the game in terms of picking up this prequel. I was super excited whenever it came out, but it just sort of fell off my radar while I was waiting for it to come out on paperback so I could buy it in paperback so that it would match my paperback Hunger Games. And in the midst of all of that, even though I was excited, I was a bit skeptical about it being about a young President Snow. I trust Suzanne Collins, but like, it just sort of felt like that was going to be a hard concept to be as interesting as the original Hunger Games trilogy was for me. But then the movie came out and everyone was singing both the movie and the book's praises, so I finally listened to the audiobook and I could not put it down. I still haven't watched the movie up to this point, but as I was listening to the audiobook, I got to Act 3 and I felt the thing that people were talking about when they said that the end of the book was pretty slow. Something shifted in the narrative there and it almost felt separate from the rest of the story. So that's what we're going to talk about today. What makes a good Act 3, why people feel like this Act 3 is pretty slow, and why it's actually the perfect finale for Snow's origin story. Beginning, middle, and end. Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. Setup, confrontation, resolution. These parts make up the whole. It is the relationship between these parts that determines the whole. Sid Field screenplay. One lens through which writers and readers look at story is the 3-act structure. It's incorrect to say that this framework was ever invented by someone because we do see it in stories throughout history, and the concept that is talked about with it dates all the way back to Aristotle. But the paradigm of the 3-act structure as we know it today and as we talk about it today was sort of popularized in the 1978 book Screenplay by Sid Field. In this book, he takes the idea of the beginning, middle, and end and describes those things as setup, confrontation, and resolution. These are the primary functions of each act, and each act is introduced by a twist that sort of spins the story in a new direction or introduces a new story goal. Act 3's job of being the resolution can really only be understood in the context of the broader story because it's the closure of everything that the plot, the character arcs, the themes have all been setting up throughout and building towards. In his book, Sid Field clarifies that resolution does not mean ending, it means solution. I personally like to think of Act 3 as a demonstration. We've gone through the story, we've gathered all this new information, and then in Act 3 we answer the question, what are we going to do about it? Are we going to make a return to the world's status quo? Or are we going to rebel against it and forge a new path? What do the characters' choices in Act 3 show me as the reader or the watcher of the movie about how their beliefs and desires have changed or stayed the same throughout the story? Because of her original Hunger Games trilogy, Suzanne Collins has been described as a master of 3-act story structure. In the original trilogy, we get the Hunger Games setting up the status quo of Panem, a dystopian society where the Capitol forces children to fight to the death as a means of control. Then in Catching Fire, we confront that status quo, as Katniss's actions from the previous book spark rebellion in the districts. And then finally in Mockingjay we get a resolution, as the rebellion kicks off in full force, deciding that the solution is to completely overturn the status quo world from the Hunger Games. Inside each book are very succinct 3-act structures as well, which leads to this collection of stories that just naturally tumbles across the page, leading to ends that are both heart-wrenching and feel inevitable. The end of each book being the thing we've been working towards this whole time, and then the finale of Mockingjay as a book and its finale on its own being the thing that the series has been leading up towards. So, what makes a good Act 3? First, and I think most obviously, an Act 3 can only be good if Acts 1 and 2 are also doing their job in confronting the central question. Then, if the Act 3 is also doing its job, that means it's answering that central question through the means of the plot and the characters and the themes and everything that makes up a story by demonstrating that answer. While people have loved The Ballad of Songbirds Songbirds and Snakes, the biggest criticism I've heard is that the pacing just feels super off at the end. Typically in your quote-unquote standard 3-act structure, the acts are divided a bit unevenly, and this holds true in the way that Sid Field describes 3-act structure in his book. Acts 1 and 3 are typically about 25% of the story each, which leaves Act 2 to be about 50% of the story. And those are just estimates that obviously shifts around from story to story and sort of depending on how you construct it. But you could almost turn this 3-act structure into a 4-act structure, dividing Act 2 into 2 and using the midpoint as another twist point that sort of spins the story into a different direction. And this is how a lot of writers use the 3-act structure. One thing I found interesting in preparing for this video is that all of the original Hunger Games books do a bit of a variation on this sort of format. Suzanne Collins divides all of her books into parts 1, 2, and 3, and all of those in the original trilogy pretty much exactly line up where the structure breaks of Acts 1, 2, and 3 are as well. And when you take a look at where those are, her books are all divided pretty much into even thirds. But even though this is a longer Acts 1 and 2 than we typically see in the use of the 3-act structure, none of these ever felt disproportionate. Take the first book, for example. In the setup, we see the status quo world of District 12, but we also see the status quo world of the Hunger Games, what the games are typically like as Katniss enters the Capitol and attends some of those preliminary events. The first story twist is when Peeta announces his love for Katniss during his interview, which propels us into Act 2. This is where we confront the status quo world of the games. How are star-crossed lovers supposed to fight to kill one another? And for Katniss, even beyond Peeta, how is she supposed to kill people she cares about like Rue? As the games go on, we get a second twist point when it's announced that 2 victors can be crowned if they are from the same district. Now there's a possibility that Peeta can live alongside Katniss. With this possibility, it propels us into Act 3, where we see Katniss take all the information that she's gathered throughout the story and choose humanity over survival. She seeks out Peeta even though he's a hindrance, and eventually at the end decides that she would rather die with him than win without him. And I think the reason why these longer Acts 1 and 3 don't feel off balance in this story is because of the plot arcs. Upon first glance, we might expect the plot arcs to line up like this, where we're in District 12 for Act 1, we're in the Hunger Games for Act 2, and then we either are finishing up the Hunger Games or going home in Act 3. But they're actually shifted so that we introduce a new location before moving into the next act. Act 1 might be a long introduction, but it's divided into 2 main set pieces, which makes each section feel fresh. The same is the case with Act 3. We finish out the games before heading back to the Capitol and eventually back to District 12. Which brings me to the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. Once again, Suzanne Collins divides her book into parts 1, 2, and 3. But this time the proportions are different, even from the original trilogy. Part 3 is significantly longer than any other Part 3 in her original trilogy, and it's the largest chunk out of this book in particular. Looking at this and knowing that we spend all of parts 1 and 2 in the Capitol preparing for and making it through the Hunger Games before Snow is sent to District 12, it makes sense how this large ending chunk feels bloated. Throughout the story, Snow's story goal, and I'm gonna be calling him Snow because Coriolanus is a bit of a mouthful. His story goal throughout has been to win a scholarship so that he can go to university and put his family in a position for upward social mobility, the kind that they have lost since the rebellion. At the end of the games, and therefore throughout Act 3, however, he's been punished for cheating in the games by giving Lucy Gray the compact and inoculating the snakes to her scent. As part of his punishment, Snow is essentially forced to become a peacekeeper, and he volunteers to go to District 12 because that's where Lucy Gray is, at least. And this sort of creates a sharp break in his goal. Now that he's in 12, there's really no hope for his future. And I think this is what creates the lull that some people feel in Act 3 and that I felt in Act 3. Because up to this point, that goal is what has been driving us through the story, and suddenly that goal has been entirely ripped away from us. When we lose that tether, we lose our sense of forward progress, and so the story kind of comes to a grinding halt. Suzanne Collins has demonstrated over and over her ability to use 3-act structure well, so why would this prequel story be such a strange departure from that? I would like to argue that this long part 3 isn't a mistake, or the result of refusing editorial notes, or whatever can sometimes cause bloated stories. I think that this long Act 3 is intentional. And I'd like to argue that first by taking another look at the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes story structure, and second by going over a few key changes that Suzanne Collins makes to the typical flow of an Act 3 that better serve Snow's character arc. First, let's return to the book's act structure. I've already established that an act is typically introduced by a twist that spins the story or the goals in a new direction. Part 2 ends with Snow being caught for cheating and told that he's not going to graduate, which is definitely a twist because it interrupts his goal, but it doesn't introduce a new one. Functionally, this moment acts more like an all is lost beat, and Snow's preparations and traveling to District 12 function more of like a darkest night. This is the section of the book where we're furthest from our goals and we feel like there's really no hope left in reaching them. And that really is what Snow is thinking and feeling at this point. There's no way for him as a peacekeeper to redeem his family name or gain any sort of upward social mobility. But then we get another twist. Sejanus shows up in District 12 as well, and he brings the hope of the officer candidate test. Even though Suzanne Collins begins part 3 at the darkest night, we don't actually enter Act 3 until page 339, which makes the act division look more like this. And this is not quite as imbalanced as they first appeared. But proportions like this don't really matter if the reader still feels like it's slow, if they still feel like the pacing is too much. Which brings me to my second point, in that the answer again lies in Snow's story goals. Although Sejanus brings with him the Act 3 story goal, the officer candidate test, Snow doesn't immediately take this on for himself. You know, if you ever wanted to take the officer candidate test, it might matter. You need to have graduated secondary school. Dean Highbottom brought that up as something that should be denied you. He said you broke some rule in the games to help Lucy Gray. Anyway, he got outvoted, Sejanus chuckled. He's really wearing on people. So I'm not universally reviled, said Coriolanus. For what? Falling in love? I think more people pity you. A lot of romantics among our teachers, come to find out, said Sejanus. And Lucy Gray made quite a good impression. Coriolanus grabbed his arm. Where is she? Do you know what happened to her? Snow's first priority in finding out this information is reuniting with Lucy Gray, not restoring his social standing, although that does come up a few pages later where he starts to think about it and he's like, oh yeah, this could be a good thing for me. But it still makes the Act 3 story goal feel like a bit of an afterthought to him, which is strange considering it's the thing that he has been wanting throughout the whole story. The difference here is that throughout the book up to this point, Lucy Gray has represented the means for Snow to accomplish his story goal. Getting her through the games, making her a big enough spectacle, this is what is going to help him achieve the scholarship that he needs to get into university and to redeem his family name. Now in Act 3, Lucy Gray has nothing to do with his story goal. In fact, she shifts from being a means to his ends to being a distraction to his ends. Every page that Snow spends with Lucy Gray is a page that he's not pursuing his story goal. And this, I think, is why many readers feel like Act 3 is slow, because Snow's time is split between Lucy Gray and pursuing his story goal. And as we've established, the story goal is what makes a story feel like it's gaining forward progress. But this split in attention is also why I think that this Act 3 is the perfect end for Snow's character arc. Remember how a good Act 3 answers the story question that has been set up and confronted throughout the book. The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes asks the question, who are we at our core? And what type of society should we build depending on that answer? Dr. Gall provides her answer about halfway through the book after Snow had to go into the arena to get Sejanus out and ends up killing one of the boys on the way. What happened in the arena? That's humanity undressed. The tributes, and you too. How quickly civilization disappears. All your fine manners, education, family background, everything you pride yourself on, stripped away in the blink of an eye, revealing everything you actually are. A boy with a club who beats another boy to death. That's mankind in its natural state. Over and over throughout the book, we see Snow choose survival over humanity. And now that we're in Act 3, where he gets the chance to demonstrate his worldview to us, Suzanne Collins sets up the story in a way to allow him to do that in a few different ways. By isolating him in District 12, she cuts him off from all of the authoritative voices that have been speaking into his life throughout the story so far. The only one that she allows in is the voice of Sejanus. So she actually sort of skews Snow's likelihood to follow one path or the other towards the empathetic side by allowing Sejanus to be there. Putting him in District 12 also puts Snow in the best position possible to learn empathy towards the people that he has been speaking down on this whole book. The girl he loves is District, no matter how much he has been trying to convince himself otherwise throughout the book. And he's surrounded by their poverty, yes, but also the closeness that exists and the community that exists within that, especially within the Covey. This is the sort of setting where humanity undressed is most likely to present itself. You would think that Snow would be confronted with example of people choosing survival over humanity, but what you actually see is people choosing humanity over survival, even whenever they're starving. And in this setting, away from the capital, we get those two paths. Continue to pursue upward social mobility at the expense of the oppressed by becoming an officer, or reject the paradigm of the capital that authoritarian control is the only way to tame the savage beast within us by running away with Lucy Gray. Snow sort of oscillates between these two as Act 3 progresses, but as the officer candidate test approaches, we see him prioritize that path over the other. He pushes for the extermination of the Mockingjays, seeing them as a symbol of the capital's power gone rogue, even though Lucy Gray is very fond of them. He betrays Sejanus to expose rebel plans and kills Mayfair so that she can't connect him to those plans too. Even though Snow sets out with Lucy Gray at the end to run away, we as the reader know that he would not be choosing that path if the threat of being tied to the murders of Billy Tope and Mayfair didn't exist. We know that if there wasn't a threat to his own survival in choosing that path, he would. You're the youngest person ever to pass the test, the commander beamed. Ordinarily we'd train you here, but your scores recommended you for an elite program in District 2. We'll be sorry to see you go. Oh, how he wished he could go. To District 2, which was not really that far from his home in the capital. To officers' school, elite officers' school, where he could distinguish himself and find a way back to the life worth living. This might be an even better road to power than university had offered. But there was still a murder weapon with his name on it out there. His DNA would condemn him, just as it had on the handkerchief. Sadly, tragically, it was too dangerous to stay. When he and Lucy Gray find those guns in the cabin, the last piece of evidence tying him to this murder is gone. It's dealt with. Nothing can tie him except Lucy Gray, who now becomes the biggest threat to his survival. Throughout the story, Lucy Gray shifts from being the thing that is going to get him what he wants to being the thing that most threatens him getting what he wants. And that is why the end is the way that it is. And that is why, to me, the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes ending is perfect as an ending to Snow's origin story. It feels a bit different than what we might have expected, because instead of one goal propelling him to the end, we see Snow have the option to take two paths. We see him isolated without the influences in his life, making a decision on his own to choose the path that ends up bringing him to be the dictator that we see in the original Hunger Games trilogy. Did you think about the Hunger Games? She asked. The day we met, Casca asked you what their purpose was, and you gave the stock answer, to punish the districts. Would you change that now? Coriolanus remembered the conversation he had with Sejanus as they'd unpacked his duffel. I'd elaborate on it. They're not just to punish the districts. They're part of the eternal war, each one its own battle, one we can hold in the palm of our hand instead of waging a real war that could get out of control. And they're a reminder of what we did to each other, what we have the potential to do again, because of who we are, he continued. And who are we, did you determine, she asked. Creatures who need the capital to survive. Thank you so much for watching. I know this is a bit of a different video than I usually do, but I'd like to do some more story analysis style videos going into the new year. So let me know if you'd like to see more like this, and let me know what your thoughts were on the end of the book. Like I said, I didn't see the movie, but I've heard that Act 3 in the movie weirdly feels incredibly rushed rather than in the book, which people say feels slow. And not knowing where those proportions work out in the movie, if I had to guess, they probably structured the movie in a more traditional 25%, 50%, 25% way, which leaves very little time in a movie to kind of explore those two paths that Suzanne Collins sets out for us in the book. But I would love to hear your thoughts on how those compared, if you thought the movie fixed some of those pacing issues or just made them worse in a different way. Let me know what you think about the book, about the movie, about this video, and until next time, I will see you soon. Bye!